Good morning and welcome to the Shoal Nash and Farb webinar. Today we are going to talk about the new financial statement that's been issued by the FASB. And I think most of you know that we've been talking with our clients the last couple of years, but as we're getting closer to implementation, we thought it'd be a good idea to refresh everybody and provide some implementation guidance. I'm David Ashenfarb, a not-for-profit director here at Shoal Nash and Farb.
And I'm Nina Bakajewska, Director of Quality Control.
Great. So we sent out this invitation to our clients. We did ask them if they wanted to share with some of their colleagues, board members, et cetera. So I'm sure most of you know who we are. But for those who are new to Shoal Nash and Farb, we are a smaller firm located in the New York City area that concentrates on nonprofit organizations. We currently have more than 200 clients in the nonprofit sector in a variety of different areas. So we're going to try to focus this session on the issues that we think impact our clients the most, but I think you'll all get some useful information as we go along. What we want to try to do today is really cover a few very basic things. I'm going to probably summarize 5 major points. The first one is with the new financial statements. There's changes in the way the net asset classifications work. In addition, there's now a requirement for reporting of functional expenses. There's some changes in the way investment returns and the related expenses will be presented on the financials. There's a new footnote disclosure requirement for liquidity and the availability of resources that the nonprofits have. And then last, there's going to be some cash flow considerations on the cash flow statement. We're going to take some questions and answers at the end. We'll try to get to everything if we can. If we don't, you can obviously reach out to me or any of the managers that you work with on a regular basis. Okay? So since most of you attend the audit committee meetings that we have when we present the financials at the end, you know that I probably sound like a broken record at this point, that I try to stress that the financial statements are yours as the entity, and what we're trying to do as the auditors is give our opinion on the financials. As part of that practice, I think for you to understand what these new rules are, I think it'll be very advantageous for you because there's a lot of flexibility in certain areas. So I want to make sure that you have the ability to present information that tells the story the way you want to present it for your agency and not just fall into the templates that we start to put together working with so many clients. Throughout the presentation, there'll be some examples. We try to pull some real live information either from the financial accounting standards themselves or from little excerpts of organizations that have already adopted. So please try to keep this in mind as we go through this. So the first thing that the new standards do is change the net asset classification. Currently, as I'm sure you're all aware, we have 3 classes of net assets: unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and permanently restricted. For those of our clients that don't have donor endowments, you're not used to seeing the permanently restricted category, although most do have at least 10, but not all. So I think for those that don't have those permanent endowments, you're not going to see as much of a change as others. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going from 3 classes of net assets down to 2. The unrestricted is now going to be referred to as without donor restrictions, which is pretty self-explanatory. What we're going to do is we're going to collapse the temporarily restricted and the permanently restricted into one category, one class of net assets that we're going to refer to as with donor restrictions. And I think by having that word donor in both classes of net assets, it re-emphasizes that for something to be considered restricted, it has to come by way of a donor contribution. So certain restrictions that are done by law, by contract, by grant agreement may not necessarily be considered a restriction for the financial statements if it's not considered a contribution. Because we're collapsing those two net asset classes, there'll be more of an emphasis within the footnotes describing the nature and the amount of the donor restrictions. And just as a reminder, if the board has designated net assets that are reserves or specifically restricted, those will still fall under the unrestricted, or now what will be referred to as the without donor restricted class of net assets. And we're going to talk about some of the examples of that in a minute. In thinking about how you as an entity are going to go about implementing, I think there's probably several questions you want to start to ask yourselves and talk about with those within the organization. First is, the basic of which net asset class does certain activity fall within. And I think that's going to help determine on the financial statements whether things are without donor restrictions or with donor restrictions. Again, re-emphasizing that the with donor restrictions are things that come by way of contribution. If there's donors that give donations for things that have specific program restrictions, if they're for a specific purpose, or if they're for a specific time period. Those are the things that would have typically fallen under the the temporarily restricted class of net assets. And then we've also got the donor endowments. Those are things that must be maintained in perpetuity, and those are the things that used to fall under the permanently restricted class. One of the next questions you need to ask yourself, one of the decisions you're going to need to make is when you present the information on your financial statements, do you want to show the specifics of those restrictions on the face itself, or do you want to do that within the footnotes? And we'll have a few examples in the slides, slides 8 and 9, and a couple of others. We'll show examples both ways, and hopefully that'll give you an opportunity to think about that and see which works best for your organization. I think from a practical point of view, the other thing you need to think about once you kind of look at the end product and decide what those financial statements are going to look like is trying to think about, do your books and records, are they set up in a way that will easily let you map out the information from the books to the financials? Do you need to do spreadsheets to enhance that, or can you set that up, through the books themselves? So those are, I think, the things that you need to think about as part of this. When I first started, I mentioned that board designated will be in the class of net assets without donor restrictions. And again, that's consistent with the past where we called it unrestricted. The thing to keep in mind is that what's now new is that GAAP requires information to be reported about the amounts and the purpose of those specific board designations. And so in the past, it was optional. So some of our clients did put it in, while others didn't. So I think from a practical perspective, where we see some challenges, or we hope won't be challenges if you start to think about this early, is if you do have board designated net assets, how is that documented? Have the board minutes been clear that that management can't access certain funds without board approval? Or is it just something that has historically just sort of been passed on and nobody really knows the origins of that? So So I think it gives you a good opportunity to sit back and get these things documented prior to the end of your year. Certain circumstances, the board may designate investment accounts, other reserves to management, the executive director, the CFO. So in cases like that, if that designation comes from the board level, they'll still be considered board restricted, and so they'll have to follow the same rules. So those are the kind of things we want to make sure that you all can start to document to make the audit process go a little bit smoother. Other things to think about with implementing this new standard, as I said, if things are a little bit loose within the organization, it's probably a good idea to establish specific policies that outline the board designations, who can authorize and appropriate funds for use, how those funds will be used, and what conditions those funds could be made available. I think if you, as an organization, can take the information that we're providing today and with your own supplemental reading of the FASB statements, start to actually draft that footnote. I think you can run that by us in advance, and that'll give us an opportunity to think about ways that we can make those statements look better. Okay, so I mean that's I think a pretty good summary of the basic rules. What I want to do is walk you through briefly a few examples. And so you can see on slide 8, we've got the current GAAP model, where, as you can see from the shaded lines, we have the 3 classes of net assets: the unrestricted, temporary, and permanently restricted. After we adopt, you'll notice that, again, on the balance sheet or the statement of financial position, we will be down to 2 classes: without donor restriction and with donor restriction, just as I mentioned up front. We have an alternate presentation. So again, this would be the balance sheet. This would be the statement of financial position. And what this entity decided to do was, since it had some what they felt were important donor restrictions, and they had some different types of board restricted, they decided to lay out right on the face of the statement itself what those restrictions were. So that is an option that's available. And again, those are things that you can think about as an organization, and we would be happy to help you think through as well. Alternatively, if you go with the more simplified approach, as we went through with just the without donor and the with donor restrictions, you'll see that you'll be required to have a more enhanced footnote disclosure that lays out the specific restrictions. So again, this is a nice example of how that footnote might look. Okay? Same with the statement of activities. This is how we currently see it. You'll see that we've got the 3 classes of net assets laid out side by side. And then after adoption, you'll see that we're down to 2 classes: the without donor and the with donor restrictions. Okay? So again, hopefully that this will provide enough of a basis for you to look at and determine what look you like the best, and can make decisions accordingly. So I'm going to turn it over to Nina now to talk about some specific issues about endowments and how that's going to impact the net asset classes as well.
Thank you, David. When it comes to underwater endowment, there are a couple of changes that were made by this new standard. But before we dig in, before we go into the details, I would like to first identify what the underwater endowment means. FASB defines it as the endowment fund, which is which has the fair market value less than the donor provided value. So let me give you an example. Let's say a donor contributes $1 million to the organization to be invested in perpetuity. And then the funds are invested and the value drops to $900,000. So that $100,000 difference would be considered an underwater endowment. Under current rules, this $100,000 is treated as unrestricted net assets. And what the new requirement makes it moves it to the class with donor restrictions. It is kind of a positive change, as previous treatment as unrestricted created some confusion. Why would a depreciation of the restricted funds be netted or presented as unrestricted? So now it's going to be as part of your restricted net assets. For some other positive changes around the underwater endowment is one of the changes, the enhanced disclosure, where we would be required to provide more information to the user of the financial statements in terms of the magnitude of the underwater funds. Currently, we are disclosing just the total fair value of the underwater endowment funds. It doesn't really tell the user much. What would happen going forward, we will provide the fair value of the underwater fund compared to the original endowment gift. Let's say, going back to my example of $1 million, we'll provide that $1 million and the fair value would be $900. So we'll show that $100,000 of underwater is actually on the original gift of $1 million, which approximately 10% of that original gift. Another positive change is that not-for-profits will be required to disclose ability to spend from those underwater endowment funds. MIFA, it's the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Fund Act, allows non-for-profit organizations spending from the endowment funds. But the spending is not, it's not done automatically. The spending should be in accordance with the donor restrictions and as well approved and considered by the board to be prudent. So the non-for-profit organizations would have to go through this analysis to ensure that if you continue spending, it's still in accordance with the donor restrictions and it is still in accordance with the current laws. We are providing here a couple of tips on the implementation. So the first thing that you would need to go is to review your current existing endowment footnote disclosure and make sure that the two net asset categories are presented instead of the three. So you no longer have unrestricted, temporary restricted, and permanently restricted. You're going to have two classes with donor restrictions and without donor restrictions. And you would have to make sure if you have underwater funds that they are presented in the class with donor restrictions. Some considerations would need to be made whether you want to present 2-year financial or 1-year financial, as this change, this particular change moving underwater endowment from one class to another class creates a restatement on your financial statement. So if you have underwater endowment, this first year of implementation would have to be restated, and you will see that as a prior period restatement on your financial statement. And once you go through the exercise of developing a policy in terms of the spending and gathering the information that is currently required or will be required to disclose, gathering the fair market value compared to the original donor gifts, you'll be able to draft the disclosure as per the new requirements. Moving to the next area is the reporting of expenses. Many of you will feel like you have this covered as you currently presenting your expenses in the form of a statement of functional expenses. But you'll see there are other things that you would need to consider as you're going through the implementation of this standard. Currently, only health and welfare organizations are required to present statement of functional expenses. All other organizations are just, this presentation is recommended for all other organizations. But for all others, it is required to have the expenses presented by nature and function, but it's not necessarily in one location. That's what's going to happen going forward. New standard will require to present by nature and function in one location. The organizations will have a choice to present in one location on the face of the financial statement, that's on the statement of the activities itself, within the notes to the financial statement, or as a separate statement of the functional expenses. So let's say if you were a small organization, like a good example would be a foundation with one program grant making, presentation on the statement of activities would be appropriate for this type of the organization. But if it's more complex, you have multiple programs, the best presentation would be statement of functional expenses. In addition to that, new standard requires a disclosure of the allocation methodologies used to allocate among different programs and support functions.